This presentation is brought to you by the MFOA.
Hello everyone, welcome to MFOA's webinar entitled How to Conduct a Business Process Review and Incorporate Internal Controls into Policy and Procedures documents. We have a very good cross-section of members attending this webinar today from small, medium, and large municipalities, so we welcome you today. And now I'd like to introduce you to your presenter. Kyle Nicholson has his HB.Com and BA. He is a CMA candidate and is a participant in the MFOA internship program, working with the townships of Crammy and Hamilton. We are very excited to have him here with us today. Thank you, and let's get started. Kyle, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, I'd just like to thank MFOA for the warm introduction and thank you, the audience, for attending this webinar. It's my pleasure today to walk you through the process used and the internal control framework that was applied in discovering risk areas at municipal facilities for the townships of Hamilton and Crammy. I'll begin the presentation with a brief internal control introduction and an overview of the operational environment for the facilities in each township. I'll then introduce the internal control framework and move on to discuss in detail its varying levels. As I progress through the framework, I'll discuss a specific example from Hamilton and Crammy that was appropriate at that level to illustrate the end-to-end process that was used. And finally, I'll conclude with some key takeaways that need to be considered for those interested in conducting a business process review and internal control implementation project of their own. So, internal controls, as I'm sure you are all aware, are a set of policies and/or procedures that are implemented in a manner that will facilitate the achievement of management objectives. So in our example, the objectives were standard of internal control projects, which were to safeguard assets, specifically by protecting cash collections from theft, reduce the risk of reporting errors, and increase facility reporting frequency. And at this point, before I proceed, I thought it may be of value to briefly introduce the townships of Hamilton and Crammy to provide the audience with a reference point that will allow for comparison to their own municipality. And it may also offer listeners an idea of the project's scope. So both Hamilton and Crammy are located in Northumberland County. Crammy, with a population of just over 6,000, operates one arena, the Keeler Center, as shown in the bottom left. And Hamilton, with a population of almost 11,000, operates two arenas. They are the two to the bottom right. All three facilities offer similar services, primarily rentals to various recurring and non-recurring user groups. The only real differentiating factor between them is that the Keeler Center in Crammy operates a canteen. The operational environment that was reviewed was to ensure that management objectives were being achieved, and the processes related to cash management, facility booking, and inventory management. The internal control framework that was applied in reviewing each of these processes was the COSO internal control framework, and a visual representation is provided in the top left. So that's the cube that you see. For those of you unfamiliar with COSO, it is the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, and it has 5 supporting organizations, which include the Institute of Management Accountants, the American Accounting Association, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the Institute of Internal Auditors, and the Financial Executives International. So, given its supporting members, it is the most widely used internal control framework, and it's quite comprehensive in nature. The COSO framework has 5 major components, each of which with their own subcomponents that total 17 steps which need to be applied in developing sound internal controls. The 5 major components include the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and finally monitoring. So each of these components has a section dedicated to it within this webinar. However, referring back to the cube at the top left, these components can govern operations, compliance, and reporting. And if you look along the right, they can be applied against an entity, division, operating unit, or function. So in the context of Hamilton and Crammy, the internal control framework was applied at the function level. And before I proceed, I thought the anecdote in the bottom left was appropriate to highlight. it shows some employees burning some documents, an employee tied up in his chair, and some people that just walked in the room who are presumably auditors with a questioning look on their faces. So I thought this was appropriate because of the caption, "What happens in accounting stays in accounting," which emphasizes that the foundation of internal controls are really the monitoring and communication. Without these activities, the framework at the top left would be incomplete, and you could end up in a situation with your hands tied like the guy in the image. So moving forward. An internal control review begins at the top of the cube with the control environment and an organization's commitment to integrity. It is used to describe what is most commonly referred to as an organization's corporate culture. When management believes that internal controls are an important component of achieving their goals and objectives, and it is communicated to employees at all levels, internal controls are a lot more likely to function well. Conversely, when internal controls are viewed as unrelated to the achievement of objectives or as obstacles even, internal controls will be viewed as such and less likely to function well, even in the presence of official documents or policies that may comment otherwise. Therefore, the key element of strong internal controls is management's attitude. In establishing tone at the top, management should always demonstrate leadership not only by clearly communicating their objectives, but also lead by example, as actions often can carry a lot more weight than words. In the context of the Hamilton and Cramy case study, the management team briefed appropriate facility staff prior to the internal control review in an effort to establish the appropriate tone. So at this point, we know that sound internal controls require a commitment from management. However, internal controls are implemented to ensure that management objectives are met. So when evaluating control effectiveness, management must specify some high-level objectives, which can vary according to the applicable internal control level in the COSO framework. So entity, division, operating unit, or function, as shown along the right side of the framework cube. Some examples at the entity level could be how to ensure employees comply with applicable law, or even how to manage unexpected staff turnover in key positions. However, in the review of internal controls at Hamilton and Cramy, the function level was evaluated with the objectives of safeguarding cash while ensuring operational efficiency. Given that our objectives have been defined, we now needed to isolate the activities that exposed our objectives to risk. So in this context, a business process review, which is an objective evaluation of operational tasks, was performed to identify and analyze appropriate risk areas. In our example, the business processes that were reviewed were introduced in the introduction and are outlined on the right of the slide, and to include inventory life cycle from procurement of goods to its eventual resale, facility booking, which included both walk-in and recurring user groups, and cash collections from the sale of goods to cash handling procedures and the eventual deposit to the finance department. So in performing a review, the owners of each process were interviewed and their tasks were mapped out in flowcharts, which you'll see on the next slide. So this is an example of a business process review in flowchart format. Specifically, this is for a one-time hall rental. And before I describe the process, it's probably important to outline the features that are inherent within this flowchart document. On the left-hand side, you'll see these swim lanes here, which outlines who is responsible for all of the tasks within that lane. So in this example, you can see that facility management is responsible for completing or proper execution of all of the tasks that are adjacent to it here. And down here, it's the renter or user group. So in this swim lane, it's the user group that's responsible for completing those tasks. Within each swim lane, you'll see a number of different shapes, and each shape corresponds with a different type of task that is being performed. And there's a legend here at the bottom for your reference. However, I will quickly describe the 4 shapes that are contained within this document. The trapezoid at the top here refers to a manual process, so something that physically needs to be performed. A diamond here represents a decision point that is structured in a manner that limits the possible responses to 2, so something that can be either yes or something that can either be no. The rectangle here with the squiggly line refers to a document that needs to be filled out. And finally, the rectangle with 2 vertical lines here refers to a reference to another process. So that would be something that has a flow chart similar to this, dedicated to it. There's one last shape that I haven't introduced yet. It's these blue shaded rectangles here, here, and here. And so these rectangles overlay a few of the tasks within this process, and these are the identifiers for risk areas that have been that are being performed that could be in conflict with management objectives. So on to the process itself. This is actually a pretty straightforward process. It begins with a user group inquiry here. So facility staff then reach a decision point, and they need to check availability of the facility. If it's not available, the process ends here. And if it's available, the user group is required to complete the appropriate rental agreement contract. Management will then check the form to make sure it's properly completed and that the user group complies with all appropriate rules. If not, there's kind of a loop here until the user group will complete the form properly and agree to all of the rules. On the actual, which leads us to the next step in the process, which is to update the booking schedule, collect a deposit, and on the day of the actual event, the remainder of the invoice will be paid, and then that cash will be eventually deposited to the township office. So in this simple example, there were 3 risk areas that have been identified. At the beginning of the process, there was scheduling risk, in which a dual schedule system was used, and inquiries were checked against 2 different schedules according to whether the inquiry received was for an ICE or hall rental. As facility supervision was responsible for handling inquiries, there was the risk of double booking in periods of absent management because there was no formal delegation of authority, and personnel unfamiliar with the dual system may not properly execute calendar updates. Further, it was discovered that out-of-office emails were not being used by staff responsible for booking, so if an email inquiry were received during a vacation or sick day, there was the possibility for an inadequate response time. The second and third bubbles here and here refers to invoicing risk. Specifically, the second bubble refers to manually issued invoices. When preparing the cash deposit to the township office, we noticed that invoices were generated for all revenue sources. So that included things like public skating, vending machine, and rental revenue. However, as these invoices were non-system generated, we noticed that they were being forwarded to the township office in non-sequential order, so due to voided invoices or whatever other reason. So this created a control issue in which the invoice balance is paid by the user group because the invoice could be destroyed and the payment not recorded, and then there would be no transactional evidence there to detect theft in those circumstances. So having isolated those 3 risk areas, it's now important to estimate the impact to determine if the risk can lead to material loss or material inefficiencies. And estimating impact, a balanced assessment would consider the significance or degree of impact and the likelihood of occurrence or probability that a given risk will materialize. So in the bottom right-hand corner, we have the 3 identified risk areas that were identified in the flowchart on the previous slide. In evaluating the significance and probability of each risk, it was determined that although there is significance in the risk of double booking, the probability was a little too low for the benefit of a control to outweigh the cost of implementation. However, the risks associated with invoicing relating to theft of cash or incomplete records for audit purposes were significant enough for the benefit of a control to outweigh the associated cost. Up until this point, the risk assessment stage has been a business process review to identify risks, analyze their impact, and decide which were important enough for a control activity. And the final step in the risk assessment process would be to brainstorm appropriate controls that would mitigate the risks that were significant and probable. In assessing change, it's important to select and evaluate the appropriate control-related activities. So appropriate controls are outlined on the left side of the slide. So it includes things like a proper authorization structure where only authorized individuals are permitted to initiate the transaction, as an example, to create properly designed records where there is sequential numbering of documents and automatic duplicates through carbon copies could be created, to physically safeguard assets to minimize the risk of loss or misuse by controlling access. So in this regard, it's also important to maintain security of accounting records, as easy access to accounting records could provide those with an opportunity for an unauthorized write-off of receivables, as an example. Segregation of incompatible duties is also a typical control-related activity. An incompatible duty is one that would put an individual in a position to both commit an irregularity and then also conceal it. An example of which would be if an individual were in a position to place an order and prepare receiving reports in which fake orders could be fabricated, ultimately resulting in improper payments. And lastly, account reconciliation should be performed regularly along with inventory count verifications and analytical review to investigate any reporting discrepancies. So in the invoicing problem that was introduced 2 slides ago on the flowchart, there were a number of solutions that were brainstormed to provide staff with facility booking software to ensure that all invoices were system generated, for the finance staff to set up facility bookings as a receivable in our finance system, to have the finance department perform reconciliations of the receivable subledger for the new facility booking software against the receivables that were entered in the financial system, and to establish procedures for retaining voided invoices. So although facility rental invoices are to be system generated on the new software, manual invoices are still to be issued for the township deposit to account for other revenue sources not accounted for in the facility booking software. So each of these 4 activities are an application of one of the typical control-related activities that were introduced at the beginning of the slide and outlined on the left panel. The system-generated invoices are an example of authorization, as canceling a booking would now provide an audit trail. Having bookings set up as a receivable is an example of segregation of duties in that the finance staff now becomes aware of upcoming rentals. And further, that the township office receptionist is to post transactions from deposits received from each arena to a clearing account, and the financial analyst is then responsible for clearing it. The other associated benefit with this structure is that it provides a forum for the finance department and arena management to interact with each other. As payments can be made to the township office, facility management is often unaware of which user groups have and haven't paid. So when the financial analyst produced an aging receivables report, it was unknown who to target for payment. However, now at least we're hoping, is that the financial analyst will be able to easily identify the unpaid user groups And the reason I say I hope is because the finance department is just now receiving training on the new facility booking software. Reconciliations of the subledger for obvious reasons is an example of reconciliations, and finally, retaining voided invoices is an example of properly designed records. To adequately perform each of these 4 activities, it's important to assess whether or not it's technologically feasible, and if not, to develop tools to ensure operational efficiency is maintained. So in our example, the finance department was to monitor rentals in the facility booking software and reconcile the financial system against that subledger, and to monitor aging receivables from user groups. In doing this, the finance department needed remote access to the booking software to make this system or solution feasible. At the time of this webinar, however, as I just mentioned, Hamilton Township is in the process of training the finance staff on the booking software that was selected. Fortunately for us, it's offered on a cloud, which means that finance staff can monitor the rentals over the internet. So provided that the appropriate control activities have been identified and it's technologically feasible to implement them, some documentation needs to be created for operational guidance and to deploy controls through policy and procedural documents. Each avenue that is pursued offers their own pros and cons, and referring back to the internal control framework cube in the top left, our review is being performed at the function level. Therefore, instead of choosing to implement controls through policy, which would ultimately require council approval, we decided to write procedural documents in order to retain operational control. However, for those that will perform a control review at the entity, division, or operating unit level, you may find that deploying controls through policy may be beneficial. Remembering that internal controls exist to permit management to achieve their objectives, it's important, or the information, it's important that it must be provided to meet their needs. So in this context, the information must contain the appropriate content and be provided to the appropriate individual in a timely manner that allows the individual receiving the information to take effective action. And further, it must be accurate, as information is only valuable to the extent to which it reflects true information. And lastly, it must be accessible, in that the information is readily available and understood by the people that need it. So applying these 4 pillars of reliable information to the example outlined in this webinar, retaining voided invoices is an example of appropriate content, as it satisfies demand for complete information. Reconciliations is an example of timeliness, as it is a function routinely performed, allowing for verification of past events. Monitoring rentals in the booking software is an example of accuracy, as the finance department is now aware of the walk-in user groups. And upgrading the facility booking software to the internet-based booking system allows for the relevant information to be accessible. To ensure proper functioning of all internal controls, ongoing communication needs to be performed to employees both inside and outside the department. So policy and procedural documents need to be continually reviewed to ensure proper execution and to maintain operational effectiveness, which feeds into the foundation of the internal control framework, which is the monitoring activities. And that internal control implementation is really an ongoing process. So an analytical review to investigate discrepancies should be performed, and any control deficiencies need to be communicated when they are detected. In this regard, communication and monitoring are the foundation of a sound control environment where two-way communication is really emphasized. So that was a brief introduction to internal controls, and it was an end-to-end process of how to perform a business process review, identify control weaknesses, evaluate potential solutions, and implement internal controls. The facility booking process that was used as an example in this presentation was just one of a combined 30 processes between the 3 facilities that were evaluated in the review. Some key things to remember when conducting a business process review or implementing any internal controls are to ensure that the project scope is reasonable and that the expectations are defined and communicated to all stakeholders. This is important because solving all possible control deficiencies isn't possible, at least not in a constrained resource environment where implementation may outweigh any associated benefit. And also because it's important to develop and implement controls in a collaborative environment. So if processes are looked at as something that's forced upon them as opposed to something that people helped create, it's a lot more likely that the process will be adopted. Also, the objectives really need to be communicated. If the objectives of a procedural change are unknown, the process owner responsible for that specific task won't understand why procedures are changing, or is less likely or less willing to adapt. And lastly, I would recommend not to change too much, or at least change in increments. So, as part of our review, I provided facility management with a stack of documents that, at the time, I didn't realize would be intimidating. So, instead of presenting staff with a final product of procedural documents, it would be better to condense them and include all stakeholders in their development. So it's at this time that I would like to thank the audience for listening, to thank MFOA for inviting me to present, and on that note, conclude the webinar, pass things back over to MFOA and open the floor to any discussion. So thank you for listening.
So thank you so much for this. Yeah, like Kyle was saying, we will open the floor now for questions from the audience. So please type your question into the chat box. Thank you. So at this time, there are 3 questions. The first one for you, Kyle, how much input did area staff have?
They had quite a bit of input. So what we ended up doing was when I first arrived, I interviewed staff, and very much through informal interviews, mapped out all of their processes and flowcharts, as was shown in the slide deck. So once I mapped out the process they used for facility booking, inventory management, and cash management, I would go back to appropriate arena staff just for verification. So that the process was correct. So in just the review process, they, were continually engaged in ensuring that we had accurate flowcharts. And then from that point forward, as we were brainstorming solutions, we would keep the facility and arena staff updated, and we would allow for their input. So what we ended up doing was we would meet with them. They would suggest solutions as well. Then I would draft up some procedural document drafts, and together we would go through it step by step to make sure everything made sense. So they ended up having quite a bit of input in the process.
All right, thank you. The second question we have is, was there 2 different software programs for facility booking and accounting/finance?
Yeah, they're 2 different systems. So facility staff have their own facility booking software, and it's really just like a master scheduling system that keeps track of rentals coming in and what user groups are available. And the financial system that's used at the Township office is we're transitioning into Great Plains right now. So yeah, they are 2 distinct software systems.
All right, thank you. Another question that we have is, can you recommend a timeline for this process?
It depends on a number of factors. It depends on complexity, breadth, and depth of the project. So in our case, we were reviewing 3 facilities simultaneously, so that added a little bit of time to the project. Any internal control implementation project requires a thorough understanding of the operational environment. So the risk assessment stage, where we mapped processes and flowcharts, was essential, and it probably took 2 to 3 weeks just to fully interview staff, map it in flowcharts, and verify that what was mapped was correct. From that point forward, it really depends on if you have staff dedicated 100% to this project. Unfortunately, some other competing priorities came into play for me, so it wasn't a full-time project, and the options analysis stage probably took another 2 to 3 weeks, and then another 2 to 3 weeks to draft up some procedural documents and have them reviewed by facility staff. So it really depends on the breadth, depth, and complexity of what you're reviewing, if that answers your question.
All right, thank you. Another question, how did you document your control activities? And did you use a spreadsheet? And do you have an example that you could provide for our webinar attendees?
Yeah, so the control activities are really inherent in the procedural documents that were written. So I'm assuming that it's okay to share the procedural documents. They have yet to receive final approval, but I'm sure once they are, that it would be okay to share them with you, yes. And we ended up using quite a number of tools, spreadsheets definitely, particularly with things like cash management, petty cash. Before they didn't use spreadsheets to monitor petty cash levels as an example, so we created some spreadsheet tools on their behalf for them to use. So to answer your question, yes, and I'm sure it will not be a problem to share any documentation that we created with you.
All right, thank you. And which software did you use to create the process review flowchart?
I used Microsoft Word, which is not the best software to use. It's not very user-friendly for flowchart creation, unfortunately. Typically, when you're creating flowcharts, Microsoft Visio is the industry standard. However, my computer isn't equipped with that software, so I had to use Microsoft Word. Definitely would recommend Microsoft Visio if you're doing a project like this on your own, because it's a lot more user-friendly and intuitive.
All right, thank you. What type of activities did you use to reinforce the changes?
I guess I should note that, or I mentioned a minute ago that the procedural documents have yet to be finalized. So we're currently working with facility staff to go over the procedural documents and ensure that they all make sense, all of the changes are understood, and before we reach a final conclusion on the procedural document changes. So as far as that is concerned, really the initiative to schedule meetings with facility staff is really our monitoring activity at this point to ensure that the ball keeps rolling on the project.
All right, and another question, what was your biggest challenge in this whole process, and how did you overcome it?
Excellent question. The biggest process or challenge, I guess, was staying focused on the project. So I mentioned, I think, throughout the presentation that we had a couple of competing priorities that came into play, which unfortunately meant that this project had to take a backseat temporarily. So the biggest challenge was having somebody dedicated 100% of the time to the review and implementation process. So it's really really to overcome that challenge, and if I was looking back, would be to create a detailed work plan at the beginning with specific deadlines, and hold people accountable to them would be the way to overcome that challenge.
All right, so thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. We appreciate your feedback and ask that you take a few minutes to complete the survey we will be sending you after this broadcast. For additional resources on a broad range of topics, please visit MFOA's virtual library. The library is your one-stop shop for policies, RFPs, guides, legislation, and regulations from across the province. Visit www.mfoa.on.ca/library today. Thank you. Bye for now.